March 10, 1945. Midnight over Tokyo. A low, heavy drone fills the air, rolling across the darkness like distant thunder that refuses to fade. Below, a city of 9 million souls sleeps uneasily beneath rooftops of wood and paper. The streets are narrow, the homes are close, everything is waiting. Then the sky ignites. Trails of fire pour down like molten rain, streaking through the blackness in terrible beauty. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods become furnaces. The temperature climbs beyond 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt bubbles and melts beneath fleeing feet. The Sumida River begins to glow red, reflecting flames that dance across its surface like demons born from the water itself. That night, more people died in a single bombing than in Hiroshima or Nagasaki combined. And yet, this was not an atomic bomb. It was something older, simpler, and far more terrifying. This is the story of how the United States turned the skies into fire, and why Japan's military for the first time realized they could no longer defend their empire. By February of 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point that few in Tokyo were willing to acknowledge. Japan's empire was collapsing. Island after island had fallen to American forces. Iwo Jima was under assault. Okinawa would be next. The once mighty Imperial Navy lay shattered at the bottom of the Pacific, its carriers and battleships reduced to coral-encrusted tombs. Yet Tokyo remained defiant. The city still stood largely intact, a sprawling metropolis of wood and tradition that seemed to mock the American bombers circling overhead. For months, the United States had attempted precision bombing runs with their new B-29 Superfortress aircraft, the most advanced heavy bomber ever built. These massive silver machines flew at altitudes where the air grew thin and cold, dropping their payloads from heights that should have guaranteed safety and accuracy. But the reality proved frustrating. Japan's weather patterns conspired against precision. Jet streams at high altitude threw bombs off course by miles. Dense cloud cover obscured targets. The B-29 seconds burned enormous amounts of fuel just to reach Japan from distant island bases, leaving little margin for error. Bombs that were meant to strike factories instead fell into rice fields and empty lots. The war dragged on each day, costing more lives, more resources, more political will. Then came Curtis LeMay. In February, this young, calculating general replaced Haywood Hansell as commander of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay was 38 years old, blunt in manner, ruthless in strategy. He studied intelligence reports on Japanese cities and saw what others had missed. He saw that precision was a fantasy, that trying to hit individual factories in a city built of wood was like trying to shoot a single match in a forest. LeMay decided he would not aim for factories. He would burn the forest itself, every block, every home, every workshop and warehouse, every heartbeat that fed the war machine would be consumed by fire. He would strip away the illusion of safety that kept Tokyo's population working, believing, enduring. The question he posed to his staff was simple and terrible. Could fire, not atomic power, force Japan to surrender? And how far would America go to make that happen? The answer was already being prepared in the bomb bays of 334 B-29 superfortresses. Curtis LeMay spent his first weeks in command studying maps of Tokyo with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient before a dangerous operation. Intelligence officers spread aerial photographs across tables in dimly lit briefing rooms. The images revealed a city that seemed designed for its own destruction. Tokyo was not like the cities of Europe with their stone cathedrals and concrete apartment blocks. It was a metropolis built almost entirely of wood and paper. Homes pressed against each other in tight clusters, separated by alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass. Factories sat intermingled with residential neighborhoods. There were no clear boundaries between military and civilian, between industrial and domestic. The entire city functioned as a single organism, its millions of workers living within walking distance of the workshops that produced uniforms, ammunition boxes, ball bearings, and optical equipment for the war effort. LeMay read the reports with cold pragmatism. Tokyo is a city waiting to burn, one intelligence summary concluded. The narrow streets would funnel wind. The wooden structures would ignite easily. Once fire took hold, it would spread faster than any civil defense could contain. But precision bombing had failed. LeMay needed a new approach, one that violated every doctrine his crews had been trained to follow. He ordered his B-29 seconds to fly low, stripping away the altitude advantage that had protected them from anti-aircraft fire. He told them to fly at night when visibility was nearly zero, but Japanese fighters would be grounded. Most shocking of all, he ordered the removal of defensive guns and ammunition from the aircraft to save weight, allowing each bomber to carry more incendiaries. His crews thought he was insane. Flying low and slow over enemy territory defenseless seemed like suicide. But LeMay had studied Japanese air defenses and found them weak, their radar primitive, their night fighter force nearly non-existent. The risk was calculated. The weapon he chose was the M69 incendiary cluster bomb. Engineers had designed it specifically for this purpose. Each cluster contained 38 smaller bomblets, packed with napalm, a jellied gasoline that stuck to whatever it touched and burned at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The magnesium casings ignited on impact, scattering fire across wide areas. A single cluster could set an entire city block ablaze. Each B-29 would carry nearly 7 tons of these incendiaries. LeMay calculated that 300 bombers could drop over 1,600 tons of fire in a single night. One bomb cluster could ignite a block. 100 could ignite a neighborhood. 1,000 planes could incinerate a city. LeMay knew what this meant. He was not targeting military installations in any traditional sense. He was targeting the city itself, the people who lived and worked there. Tens of thousands of civilians would die, perhaps more. But he rationalized it through the arithmetic of total war. To him, Tokyo's workforce and factories were inseparable. The women sewing uniforms in their homes, the men assembling fuses in backyard workshops, the children carrying supplies through the streets, all were part of the war machine. To LeMay, the city itself was the factory, and factories could be destroyed. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo's military command centers, Japanese generals dismissed the threat. American bombing raids had been ineffective for months. Why would this change? No bomb can burn Tokyo, one officer reportedly said. The city had survived earthquakes and fires before. Civil defense preparations included neighborhood fire brigades and designated evacuation routes. Water reservoirs dotted the city. Fire breaks had been cut through some districts, creating gaps meant to stop flames from spreading. But these preparations were incomplete, underfunded, designed for accidental fires and small-scale emergencies. No one had prepared for what was coming. No one had imagined that the sky itself could become a weapon, that fire could fall like rain, that an entire city could be transformed into an inferno in the span of a single night. They believed the empire could endure anything. They had weathered years of war, absorbed defeat after defeat, and still Tokyo stood proud and defiant beneath its paper lanterns and wooden eaves. They had not yet seen what fire could do when it fell from heaven by the ton. The evening of March 9th began quietly on the islands of the Marianas. On Guam, Saipan, and Tinian American airfields, stretched for miles, their runways carved from coral and volcanic rock. The sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the Pacific in shades of copper and violet. Along the flight lines, ground crews swarmed over rows of B-29 superfortresses, loading them with a cargo unlike any they had carried before. No high-explosive bombs tonight, no precision munitions, only fire. Crate after crate of M69 incendiary clusters was hauled into bomb bays. Each aircraft would carry roughly 6 tons of these weapons packed so tightly that navigators had to squeeze past them to reach their stations. The crews watched in silence as the loading continued. They had been briefed on the mission parameters and the details unsettled them. Low altitude, night operations, no defensive armament, target the heart of Tokyo. Some of the men were veterans of European bombing campaigns where they had flown in formation at 25,000 feet, protected by fighter escorts and thick armor plating. This felt different. This felt exposed. But orders were orders, and by nightfall 334 B-29 seconds stood ready on the runways, their engines warming in the tropical air. At 1700 hours, the first bombers began to lift off. One after another, the massive aircraft thundered down the runways and clawed their way into the darkening sky. Their wings were heavy with fuel and fire. The roar of their engines echoed across the islands like approaching thunder. By the time the last B-29 departed, night had fallen completely, and the formation disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. For the crews, the flight was long and monotonous. 6 hours over open water with nothing below but darkness and the occasional whitecap catching moonlight. At 17,000 feet, the cold seeped through the fuselage. Men huddled in their flight suits, checking instruments, rechecking coordinates, trying not to think too hard about what awaited them. Below them, 9 million people slept under wooden rooftops, unaware that the largest incendiary strike in history was crossing the ocean toward them. Tokyo appeared first as a distant glow on the horizon, the faint lights of the city diffused through haze and darkness. At 0130 hours, the Pathfinder aircraft arrived overhead. These lead bombers carried a different payload, magnesium flares, designed to mark the target zones. They descended through the night and released their markers in precise patterns, giant X-shapes of brilliant white light that hung in the air like fallen stars. From the ground, air raid sirens began their mournful wail. Civilians stumbled from their beds, confused and frightened. Previous raids had been scattered and ineffective. Most people assumed this would be the same. Some retreated to shelters, others simply watched the sky waiting. Then the second wave arrived. 29 seconds appeared in the darkness like enormous predators, their engines, a deep resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the city. Bay doors opened, the first clusters fell. Each cluster split apart in mid-air, releasing 38 smaller bomblets that tumbled end over end before striking rooftops, streets and courtyards. For a moment, there was only the sound of impact, a strange, almost gentle rattling as the cylinders bounced and rolled. Then they ignited. Orange blooms erupted across entire neighborhoods simultaneously. The napalm clung to wood and paper, spreading with terrible efficiency. Flames leaped from house to house, building to building, consuming everything they touched. The fire did not simply burn, it devoured. It moved with hunger and intelligence, seeking fuel, following the wind growing stronger with each passing minute. Within 20 minutes, the wind itself began to change. Heat from thousands of fires created updrafts that pulled air inward from all directions. A firestorm was forming, a phenomenon where fire creates its own weather system. Winds reached hurricane force, fanning flames to even greater intensity. The temperature climbed beyond comprehension. In command bunkers, deep beneath the city, Japanese military officers received the first frantic reports. The messages were fragmented, panicked, almost incoherent. The fire cannot be contained. Entire districts burning. We need reinforcements, and then silence as telephone lines melted. Generals stared at maps, trying to comprehend the scale of what was happening above them. It was not bombing, it was erasure. On the streets of Tokyo, the world had become unrecognizable. What began as isolated fires had merged into a single living wall of flame that advanced through neighborhoods with the speed of a galloping horse. The heat arrived before the fire itself, a suffocating wave that dried throats and seared lungs. People who had been sleeping minutes earlier now ran through streets illuminated brighter than noon, their shadows dancing grotesquely against walls that would soon cease to exist. The firestorm created its own wind, howling through alleys with a sound like 1,000 trains screaming in unison. This wind was strong enough to lift adults off their feet and hurl them into the flames. Debris became projectiles, sheets of burning wood, fragments of metal, entire sections of roof spinning through the air like deadly kites. Those caught in the open had nowhere to hide. Families fled together, clutching children and elderly relatives carrying whatever they could salvage. But the fire moved faster than human feet. It leaped across fire breaks that were supposed to stop it. It jumped streets. It seemed to anticipate where people would run and arrived there, first cutting off escape routes, herding the living into ever smaller pockets of ground not yet consumed. Fire wardens, men and women trained to fight blazes with hand pumps and bucket brigades, stood helpless as their equipment proved useless. Water mains had burst from the heat. Reservoirs ran dry within the first hour. The few streams of water they could produce evaporated before reaching the flames. Some wardens continued fighting anyway, refusing to abandon their posts even as the fire surrounded them. Their bodies would later be found still clutching their equipment, turned to ash where they stood. The Sumida River became a magnet for the desperate. Thousands converged on its banks, believing water offered salvation. They dove in, entire families, submerging themselves to escape the heat. But the river provided no refuge. The firestorm had grown so intense that it heated the water itself, turning sections of the river into a scalding bath. Burning debris floated on the surface, carried by the current, igniting the hair and clothing of those who surfaced to breathe. Those who survived later described the river as choked with bodies so densely packed that you could walk across without touching water. Many had drowned not from the depth, but from the crush of other bodies pressing down from above. Others had suffocated when the firestorm consumed all available oxygen, creating pockets of air too thin to sustain life. The bridges became killing zones. Crowds converged on them from both sides, meeting in the middle in a chaotic mass of humanity, pressed so tightly that movement became impossible. When the flames reached the bridges, there was nowhere to go. Some jumped into the river below. Others simply stopped, exhausted beyond the capacity to flee, and waited for the end. In just 3 hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo vanished. An area the size of Manhattan, home to over 1 million people, was reduced to cinders and ash. The densely packed wooden neighborhoods of the eastern wards, Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, ceased to exist as recognizable places. Where there had been homes and shops and temples and schools, there remained only a flat expanse of grey ash, interrupted occasionally by the skeletal remains of concrete structures, too stubborn to burn completely. When American reconnaissance pilots flew over the city at dawn, they struggled to find words for what they saw. One described it as a sea of black and orange scars stretching to every horizon. Another said the smoke column was visible from 150 miles away, rising into the stratosphere like a monument to destruction. Even these men, hardened by years of war, found they could not look down for long. The scale was too vast, too complete. It violated something fundamental in the human capacity to process tragedy. By the time the sun rose on March 10th, official estimates would place the death toll at approximately 100,000 people. 1 million were homeless. 267,000 buildings had been destroyed. More people had died in this single night than in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The firebombing of Tokyo had achieved exactly what Curtis LeMay had intended. It had proven that an entire city could be erased from existence in the span of one night. The mathematics of the operation were staggering in their precision. Over the course of approximately 2 hours, 279 B-29 superfortresses had reached their target zones and released their payloads with devastating accuracy. 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs had fallen onto the most densely populated 16 square miles on Earth. The bombers had faced minimal resistance, scattered anti-aircraft fire, a handful of night fighters that failed to intercept in the darkness. Only 14 aircraft were lost, less than 5% of the attacking force. It was the most efficient mass-killing operation in the history of air warfare, and it had worked exactly as designed. In the days following the raid, Curtis LeMay reviewed the reconnaissance photographs with his staff. The images showed a transformation so complete it seemed almost abstract. Where detailed maps had once shown an intricate network of streets and neighborhoods, there now existed only a uniform grey void. Analysts struggled to identify landmarks. The city they had studied for months no longer existed in any meaningful form. LeMay understood the implications of what he had ordered. Years later, he would reflect on this moment with characteristic bluntness. "I suppose if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals," he said. He knew that what had occurred over Tokyo existed in a moral grey zone that defied easy categorization. The distinction between military and civilian targets had not merely blurred, it had evaporated entirely. But in the arithmetic of total war, LeMay believed he had found an equation that worked. In command centers across the Pacific, American officers tracked the results with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The mission had succeeded beyond even optimistic projections. Japanese industrial capacity in Tokyo had been crippled. More importantly, the psychological impact was immeasurable. For the first time, Japan's civilian population had experienced the full weight of strategic bombing, and the experience had shattered any illusion of safety. But in Tokyo itself, the reality was far more visceral than any statistical analysis could capture. When Imperial General Staff officers finally emerged from their bunkers and surveyed the ruins, they encountered a landscape that defied comprehension. The reports they had received during the night, fragmentary, panicked, contradictory, had not prepared them for the totality of the destruction. Entire districts had simply disappeared. Streets they had walked the previous day no longer existed. Temples that had stood for centuries were gone. The famous entertainment district of Asakusa, with its theaters and restaurants and crowded marketplaces, had been reduced to a flat plain of ash. Some officers wept openly. Others stood in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. For the first time, senior military commanders began to speak quietly among themselves about the unthinkable. Tokyo could no longer be defended. If the Americans could do this once, they could do it again, and again, until nothing remained. Radio silence from the affected areas lasted for hours. When communications were finally restored, the messages that came through painted a picture of absolute chaos. Hospitals were overwhelmed with burn victims. Medical supplies had been destroyed in the fires. Morgues could not begin to handle the number of dead. Many bodies were so thoroughly burned that identification was impossible. Mass graves were dug in parks and empty lots, and still they were not enough. The psychological impact rippled outward through Japanese society. In cities that had not yet been bombed, civilians looked at the sky with new dread. If Tokyo could burn anywhere, could burn. Factory workers began to flee to the countryside. Government officials quietly moved their families to rural areas. The machinery of war production, dependent on millions of urban workers, began to falter. Reconnaissance flights in the weeks that followed documented a haunting change. At night, Tokyo remained almost completely dark. The blackout was total. But it was not the darkness of a city hiding from bombers. It was the darkness of a city that no longer existed. There were no lights to extinguish, no population to protect, only survivors picking through ruins, searching for fragments of lives that had been consumed by fire. The horizon of ash stretched in every direction, a monument to the moment when industrial warfare had finally consumed its own logic, when the tools of civilization had been turned against civilization itself with mathematical precision. Curtis LeMay did not pause to contemplate the moral weight of what had occurred over Tokyo. He saw the raid as proof of concept, a demonstration that incendiary bombing could accomplish what precision strikes had failed to achieve. Within days of the Tokyo raid, he was already planning the next operation, and the next, and the next. The target list was extensive. Nagoya, Japan's third largest city, and a center of aircraft production. Osaka, the industrial heart of Western Japan. Kobe, a vital port city. Yokohama, Tokyo's neighbor and naval manufacturing hub. Each city was studied, mapped, divided into target zones, and assigned a date for destruction. Operation Meeting House, as the Tokyo raid was officially designated, became the template for a systematic campaign of urban annihilation. The tactics refined over Tokyo's skies, low-altitude night attacks with maximum incendiary loads, were replicated with ruthless efficiency. Every few nights, B-29 seconds lifted off from the Marianas carrying their cargo of jellied fire. Japanese radar operators watched the formations approach with growing dread, knowing there was nothing they could do to stop them. Nagoya burned on March 11th, just 36 hours after Tokyo. The city's aircraft factories were the stated targets, but the firestorm consumed residential neighborhoods with the same indiscriminate hunger. Osaka followed on March 13th, then Kobe, then smaller cities that had believed themselves too insignificant to warrant attention. LeMay's bombers visited them all. By summer, the campaign had expanded beyond major industrial centers to include cities with populations as small as 60,000. If a city had any war-related production, and in total war nearly every city did, it became a candidate for burning. Rail yards, food processing plants, textile factories producing uniforms, workshops making wooden crates for ammunition, all were deemed legitimate targets, and all were intermingled with civilian homes in ways that made selective targeting impossible. The numbers accumulated with grim inevitability. By July of 1945, 67 Japanese cities had experienced incendiary raids. More than 40% of Japan's urban area no longer existed. Millions were homeless. Industrial production had collapsed. The transportation network was shattered. Food distribution systems had broken down and famine loomed. In Tokyo, what remained of the military command structure operated from bunkers and scattered facilities on the city's outskirts. Army generals who had once projected confidence now slept underground, emerging only when necessary. Even Emperor Hirohito, long shielded from the direct effects of war, ordered palace guards to coat the imperial residence with sand and water as protection against incendiary attack. The symbolism was profound. The divine emperor, descendant of the sun goddess, forced to acknowledge that fire from the sky could reach even him. Within Japan's military hierarchy, fractures began to appear. Quiet conversations took place in guarded rooms, conversations that 6 months earlier would have been unthinkable. Some officers began to speak of surrender, though the word itself was dangerous to utter aloud. Hardliners denounced such talk as treason and insisted that Japan could still fight, could still endure, could still achieve some kind of negotiated peace that preserved the nation's honor. But fire was eroding more than cities. It was eroding the myth that had sustained Japanese resistance, the belief in their own invincibility, the conviction that spirit and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. When the sky itself became an enemy, when entire cities could be erased in a single night, what room remained for spiritual fortitude? Civilians wrote in their diaries of a nation transformed. Tokyo has become a city of ghosts, one survivor recorded. We walk through streets that no longer exist, past homes that are only memories. The living envy the dead, for at least their suffering has ended. The American bombing crews flying mission after mission developed their own psychological armor. They flew too high to see individual people. The fires below were abstract, almost beautiful in their terrible symmetry. Some crews convinced themselves they were hitting only military targets. Others simply stopped thinking about it, focusing on navigation, on fuel consumption, on getting home safely. A few were haunted by what they had done and would carry that weight for the rest of their lives. Fire was breaking not only cities but something deeper. The belief systems that allowed men to endure war, the narratives that justified continuation, the myths that made horror tolerable. In Washington and on Tinian Island, where the specially modified B-29 seconds of the 509th Composite Group were preparing for a different kind of mission, debates unfolded about the nature of warfare and the limits of destruction. Curtis LeMay argued forcefully that his incendiary campaign was working, that Japan was being systematically dismantled, that surrender was inevitable if the fire raids continued. Others in the military and political leadership believed a more dramatic demonstration was necessary, something so shocking, so unprecedented, that it would break the paralysis gripping Japan's leadership. The atomic bomb represented a different proposition entirely. Where firebombing required hundreds of aircraft and thousands of tons of conventional explosives, a single atomic weapon could achieve comparable destruction in an instant. The psychological impact strategists believed would be profound. Japan's leaders might rationalize conventional bombing as simply an extension of existing warfare, brutal but comprehensible. But a weapon that could erase a city in a flash of light, that killed through radiation as well as blast, that represented the harnessing of the fundamental forces of the universe. Such a weapon might shatter the will to resist in ways that mere fire could not. Yet the firebombing had already demonstrated that conventional weapons properly applied could achieve near-total urban destruction. The difference was one of efficiency and spectacle rather than outcome. A survivor of Tokyo's firestorm and a survivor of Hiroshima's atomic blast would both find their cities reduced to ash, their loved ones vaporized, their futures consumed. The method differed, but the result was remarkably similar. In Japan, military and civilian leaders faced an impossible calculus. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War met repeatedly throughout the spring and summer of 1945, struggling to find a path between annihilation and surrender. Hardliners insisted that Japan could still inflict enough casualties on an invading American force to negotiate better terms. They spoke of mobilizing the civilian population for a final defense, of turning the home islands into a fortress where every man, woman, and child would fight to the death. But the cities were burning. Food stocks were depleting, the Navy was destroyed, the Army was exhausted, and still the B-29 seconds came night after night, reducing Japan's urban infrastructure to cinders. Intelligence reports described a population approaching the breaking point, industrial workers abandoning factories to search for food, civilians fleeing to rural areas where they believed they might be safe from the fire. Those who favored surrender faced their own obstacles. The concept was almost linguistically foreign to Japan's military culture. The nation had never been successfully invaded. The emperor was divine. To surrender was to admit that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, had been for nothing. It was to accept that their sons and fathers had died in vain, that the empire they had built through blood and ambition was collapsing into ash. Civilian diaries from this period reveal a population caught between loyalty and despair. We are told to endure, to maintain faith, to believe in final victory, one Tokyo resident wrote. But how do we maintain faith when the city itself no longer exists? when the shelters offer no protection, when the sky brings only death. The firebombing had created a question that the atomic bomb would later answer with brutal finality. Destruction can end war. Does mercy have any meaning? If the goal is to break an enemy's will to fight, is there any moral difference between burning 100,000 people over 3 hours or vaporizing them in 3 seconds? American planners grappled with these questions in abstract terms, using phrases like strategic necessity, acceptable losses. But the men in the bomber cockpits, the civilians huddling in shelters, the commanders watching cities burn on reconnaissance photographs, they could not escape the visceral reality. War had always been terrible, but industrial warfare had achieved a new threshold. It had mechanized death, made it efficient, removed the individual human element that might have prompted hesitation or mercy. For Japan's leaders, the question was no longer whether they could win, but whether they could survive. The terror they felt was not the fear of military defeat that had become inevitable. It was fear of extinction, the possibility that their entire civilization might be consumed by fire before they could find words to articulate surrender. In the days and weeks following the firebombing, Tokyo became a landscape of ghosts. Survivors emerged from shelters and basements to find their neighborhoods transformed into featureless plains of ash and twisted metal. The geography they had known since childhood had been erased. Street corners where they had met friends no longer existed. Shops where they had bought rice and vegetables were gone. Temples where they had prayed for centuries had vanished as completely as if they had never been. The living wandered through this wasteland, searching for family members, calling names into the silence, digging through debris with bare hands in hopes of finding something, anything that remained. Some discovered loved ones in the mass graves that had been hastily dug in parks and open spaces. Others found nothing at all, their families reduced to ash that had mingled with the ash of 10,000 other families until individual identity became impossible. American reconnaissance aircraft returned repeatedly to photograph the damage, their cameras documenting the transformation with clinical precision. The images showed a city that had been functionally deleted from existence. Analysts compared pre-raid and post-raid photographs, struggling to orient themselves. Landmarks had disappeared. Only the rivers remained recognizable, their courses unchanged, though their banks were now lined with ash instead of homes. One pilot viewing Tokyo from altitude days after the raid reported that the sky never turned blue again, only grey. Smoke and dust hung in the atmosphere for weeks, creating sunsets of unnatural colour, casting a pall over the ruins that seemed almost supernatural in its persistence. Japanese doctors and nurses worked in conditions that defied medical training. Hospitals that had survived the flames were overwhelmed within hours. Burn victims arrived by the hundreds, then thousands, their injuries so severe that treatment often meant little more than making them comfortable before death. Medical supplies had been destroyed in the fires. Morphine ran out, bandages ran out, clean water ran out. Physicians were reduced to improvising with whatever materials they could scavenge from the ruins. Infection spread rapidly through the survivor population. Burns became septic. Respiratory damage from smoke inhalation led to pneumonia. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Bodies that had survived the flames succumbed to disease in the chaotic aftermath. The death toll continued to climb for weeks after the bombers had departed. Emperor Hirohito, sheltered in the imperial palace, made a rare visit to the devastated areas. Witnesses reported that he moved through the ruins in complete silence, his face an unreadable mask. The emperor rarely spoke in public, and he offered no words during this visit. But those who accompanied him noted his reaction when he witnessed the scope of destruction firsthand. Upon returning to the palace, he reportedly said only, "This cannot continue." The statement was profound in its simplicity. For a leader raised to view himself as semi-divine, to acknowledge that his nation faced existential threat represented a fundamental shift. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of military expansion and nationalist propaganda, had been consumed by the same fire that had consumed Tokyo's wooden homes. For Japanese military commanders, the psychological impact was even more severe. They had built careers on the premise that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that Japanese soldiers and civilians possessed a unique capacity for sacrifice and endurance. The firebombing had revealed this premise as hollow. No amount of fighting spirit could defend against fire falling from the sky by the ton. No samurai tradition could rebuild cities faster than American bombers could destroy them. The terror they experienced was not the simple fear of death that soldiers have always known. It was a deeper existential dread, the recognition that their enemy possessed the capacity and willingness to erase Japanese civilization entirely. The question was no longer whether Japan could achieve victory or even negotiate favorable peace terms. The question had become whether Japan itself would exist in any recognizable form when the war finally ended. Curtis LeMay, reviewing the results of his campaign from his headquarters on Guam, would later reflect on this period with characteristic bluntness. "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time," he said years afterward. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Every soldier thinks something of the order of, 'We, the good guys, couldn't commit war crimes.' But what makes it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win? In 3 hours, 16 square miles burned. In 3 months, 67 cities followed. In 3 days after Hiroshima, the war ended." The numbers carry a terrible precision, a mathematical elegance that seems obscene when measured against human suffering. 1,665 tons of incendiaries, 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless, 267,000 buildings destroyed. The figures accumulate like entries in a ledger, as if tragedy could be balanced through accounting. But behind every statistic lived a person who woke that morning believing they would see another sunrise, who had plans and memories and people they loved.
Excellent.
Children who would never grow old.
Excellent.
Parents
Proceed
who would
with
never
phase
see
2.
their children again. Entire family lines extinguished in a single night, their names surviving only in records that were themselves consumed by flame. The firebombing of Tokyo revealed a paradox at the heart of industrial civilization. Humanity had developed unprecedented capacity for creation engineering marvels like the B-29 superfortress, chemical innovations like napalm organizational systems capable of coordinating hundreds of aircraft across thousands of miles of ocean. And all of this genius, all of this accumulated knowledge and capability had been focused on the systematic destruction of human industry itself. The same minds that could build cities could calculate how to burn them most efficiently. The same systems that could mass-produce automobiles and radios could mass-produce death. Technology had removed the human element from killing, transformed it into an abstraction of tonnage and target coordinates and mission success rates. It was not the atomic bomb alone that broke Japan's will to continue fighting. It was the realization that fire itself could erase civilization, that the tools which had built the modern world could unmake it with equal efficiency. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were more dramatic, more symbolic, more shocking in their instantaneous destruction. But the firebombing had already demonstrated that conventional weapons properly applied could achieve comparable devastation. The mathematics of victory were written in fire, ash, and silence. Every burned city was a calculation, every casualty a number, in an equation whose solution was surrender. The efficiency was remarkable, the cost was unfathomable. Years later, historians would debate whether the firebombing was necessary, whether it shortened the war, whether the same outcome could have been achieved through other means. But for those who lived through it, who felt the heat and smelled the burning and watched the sky turn orange, such debates seemed abstract to the point of irrelevance. They had witnessed what humanity was capable of when all restraint was abandoned in pursuit of victory. The aerial photographs taken in the months after the firebombing show a city slowly attempting to resurrect itself from ash. Small structures begin to appear in the wasteland, makeshift shelters built from salvaged metal and charred wood. Survivors returning to search for anything that might have survived. Life asserting itself even in the most devastated landscape, driven by the stubborn human refusal to simply disappear. But the scars remained visible for years, decades even. Places where entire neighborhoods had stood became empty lots that nobody wanted to rebuild upon, as if the ground itself remembered what had occurred there. Survivors carried their own scars, physical burns that never fully healed, psychological trauma that manifested in nightmares and sudden moments of panic, triggered by the sound of aircraft overhead or the smell of smoke. The American bomber crews returned home to a nation celebrating victory. Some were decorated as heroes. Others simply returned to civilian life carrying memories they rarely discussed. In the decades that followed, a few would speak publicly about what they had done, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Most remained silent, choosing to let the past remain in the past. Curtis LeMay's career continued to rise. He would eventually become Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, one of the most powerful military positions in the world. His advocacy for strategic bombing would shape American military doctrine for generations. When asked about the morality of the firebombing campaign, he never retreated from his convictions. War, he insisted, was not about morality. It was about winning, and he had won. But his own words haunted him. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." The statement acknowledged what he could never fully resolve, that the line between necessary military action and atrocity was defined not by ethics, but by victory. Japanese survivors offered a different perspective. "That night we saw the sun rise," one woman recalled decades later, "but it did not rise from the east. It rose from the ground, from our own city, turning into light and heat. We had worshipped the sun, as sacred as the source of the emperor's divine power. That night we learned that human beings could create their own sun and use it to destroy everything we loved." The firebombing of Tokyo represented a threshold in human history, a moment when the industrial capacity to kill exceeded the human capacity to fully comprehend what was being done. Technology had outpaced morality. The tools of war had become so efficient, so devastating, that traditional concepts of honor and restraint became obsolete. War had always changed men, but the night Tokyo burned demonstrated that technology once unleashed changes humanity itself. It reveals what civilization is capable of when survival and victory become the only values that matter, when the enemy is abstracted into target coordinates and casualty estimates, when killing can be accomplished from 5 miles above the ground by men who will never see the faces of those they destroy. In the end, Japan surrendered not to a single bomb, but to the accumulated weight of fire and ash, and the realization that the sky itself had turned against them. And when the flames finally died, when the last embers cooled and the smoke cleared, only silence remained. The firebombing of Tokyo was not the dawn of peace. It was the final scream of total war echoing across a century that would struggle to understand what it had done to itself.